Hello there. Welcome back, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce Anand Menon, Professor Anand Menon, who's the director of the academic think tank, UK in a Changing Europe. We're going to have a conversation for about half an hour or so, but also inviting questions from you, the audience. So feel free to post your questions in the chat function, and I'll do my very best to address them all. Welcome to the program, Anand.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. Nice to be, well, not be there.
Right. Well, we're going to look to the future for most of this conversation. But before we do, let's briefly dwell on the present. A phrase you increasingly hear is that the EU-UK relationship is going to get worse, even worse, before it gets better. There's a breakdown in trust. Maros referred to that in his opening keynote. Is any of that an exaggeration?
No, I don't think so. I think actually, if anything, it's slightly worse in that, to some extent, both sides, and particularly the UK side, have a bit of an interest in that. And I say that because, you know, politically, for some people on the EU side, I think, you know, if we think about President Macron, the elections he faces next year, you could argue that, you know, watching Brexit seem to fail would help him, particularly if he's up against Marine Le Pen. You can, you know, he can turn around, point at the UK and say, that's what right-wing populism gets you. And in this country, there's even less doubt, I think, that actually a slight state of tension with the EU is good politics for Boris Johnson, partly because it reunites his coalition, partly too because it puts Labour in a very difficult position, and Labour, of course, don't know what to say or do about the EU.
Okay, right. We've set that scene. So because the Northern Ireland Protocol is taking up so much political energy and causing so much friction, do you see any appetite on either side to think of the longer-term EU-UK relationship? Does either side have a strategy?
I think the strategy on this side is probably, should the protocol be sorted out, to leave it at that. That's to say, there's no plan to deepen the relationship on the part of this government. I think it is vanishingly unlikely that under Boris Johnson, either in this parliament or, of course, conceivably the next parliament, the UK government is going to think, hang on, we better think about formalising relations on foreign policy, or, you know, expanding the deal to cover services. So on the UK side, this is about competition within the framework set down by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. On the EU side, I don't get the sense that many member states, with the potential exception of Ireland, have thought about the longer term future. They're all quietly relieved that this is done. They've all moved on to a greater or lesser extent and aren't thinking about this very much anymore.
To what extent is it appropriate or even accurate to say that the UK is not a typical third country now? It's left the EU and it should be treated differently by the EU, or is that just British so-called exceptionalism?
Well, on one level, there's no such thing as a typical third country. I mean, every trade deal is unique. So saying the UK isn't a typical third country in that sense is stating the blindingly obvious. But, you know, the UK is unique in at least two ways. First, in terms of its size, both economically and its sort of military and diplomatic assets. But secondly, because, of course, the UK is the first member state to have left. So there is a question, I think, for the European Union, which is, what do you do with your neighbours if it's not necessarily the case that those neighbours, as we had assumed for so long, want nothing more than to deepen their relationship with us? I think there is a bit of a puzzle there for the EU to ponder.
And anything but the EU, quote unquote, seems to be a slogan, at least in some parts of the British government. Europe is okay as long as it's bilateral. A fair comment, will this approach work? This idea that you can just have a string of essentially bilateral relationships as opposed to being embedded in the EU more institutionalized structure?
I think, at least publicly, yes, that's true. So you've seen the British government work with or collaborate with or sign agreements with individual member states. You've seen Dominic Raab working quite closely within the format of the E3. I don't think the government wants to be seen to be working too closely with the European Union, but I suppose there are two caveats. One, as we approach the COP26 in areas of EU competence, it's going to be very, very hard for the UK to work with individual member states rather than the EU. And second, I think this hinges on events. Imagine there was another crisis like the Libyan crisis. that would make it very easy for the French and the British to work together, dealing with a crisis that is somehow too big for the EU and too small for the US. But you could imagine other sorts of crises where the EU itself is brought into play, where it would be harder for the UK to do that. So I think it partly hinges on what happens over the next few years.
And do you think it's underlying all that is a kind of a feeling on the UK side? Maybe other large member states think the same thing, but it'd be heresy to make it public, that they'd rather play with fellow big players, and that the EU has too many smaller countries who have no real political or economic weight, and they slow down decision making.
I think it's partly that. I think it is partly a frustration. So we heard, the UK government say we don't need that complex institutional trapping to collaborate on foreign policy. I think among some members of the government too, there's a genuine ideological aversion. They don't get the European Union. They certainly don't get the bits that they see as going beyond pure trade into more political aspects of cooperation. There was an element of that, as well as of grandstanding behind Dominic Raab's stance on the EU ambassador in London. So I think it's a combination of both those things, that accounts for this attitude.
Isn't that, to be fair though, a bit of a cliche that after 47 odd years of membership, that the UK still does not get the EU? Surely after so many decades of membership, the UK does get the EU.
I don't think we've ever got the political narrative, and I think that's been the case ever since Maastricht. That it was perfectly clear at the time, that when we said federalism, we meant something very different than the other member states when they said federalism, and B, that our political class didn't really understand what political union is or was meant to be. And I think the fundamental reason for that, there are lots of reasons, but for me the fundamental reason is, for every other member state of the European Union, European integration might be an economic project, but it exists for explicitly political reasons, whether it's to prevent war for the original six, or to sort of entrench democracy after a period of authoritarian rule in the southern European countries, or to sort of institutionalize the return home for the countries of Eastern Europe. For the UK, it was always far more transactionalist than this. It was an economic project pursued for economic reasons. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've never really understood the sort of deeper political motivations of other member states.
Okay, so we've established that there's no real appetite at the moment to think medium to long term, because there's so much going on at the moment with the protocol and similar issues, obviously. But do you think there's a feeling that it's from the EU side that it's up to the UK to come up with ideas for future cooperation in whatever area? Just like during the negotiations, the EU kept saying, according to Michel Barnier's diaries, we kept asking the UK for their proposals, and they never were forthcoming. The same thing with the future relationship. Do you think there's an expectation on the EU side? It's actually up to the UK to be more the demandeur, they say in French.
I don't think there's many people on the EU side, certainly among the member states, that are obsessing about this anymore. I think, as I said, most people have moved on. And I think essentially within the European Union, their hopes at the moment are limited to the fact that we can sort out the spat over the protocol and make what we have work. I mean, remember, the TCA and the protocol are not fully functioning as yet. And I think the priority is to make what we have work before starting to think about the future, to be honest.
Well, since you mentioned the TCA, so just a long introduction to this question. The withdrawal agreement with its joint committee and the trade cooperation agreement with its partnership council provide for a multitude of working groups and the like to oversee implementation of the two agreements. So it seems that both sides will be talking to each other for quite some time. But these groups are about, and these structures are about implementation, right? And when necessary, dispute settlement. Does the parliamentary partnership assemblies set out in the TCA and the parallel civil society forum, do you think could provide, I know it's not up and running yet, could provide a vehicle for meaningful dialogue, or will they run the risk of turning into just talking shops?
They could provide that, yes. I mean, a lot depends on who turns up from each side. I mean, one of the things we've noticed on the UK side, I think, over the last decade and more, is a failure on the part of particularly Conservative MPs to engage properly with their European counterparts. And you hear that from a number of institutions that are designed to bring either specific member states in the UK or the EU and the UK together. So I think It would be great if you get proper engagement from particularly Conservative MPs in that forum. My fear is, of course, as so often happens at conferences and at meetings, that it turns out to be the sort of people who wish we hadn't left the European Union who turn up from the UK side. And actually, that's not great in terms of looking forward.
Right. So on foreign and security policy, one of the many areas you specialize in, surely both sides have to cooperate. They have to work alongside each other because the interests are so self-evident. The EU has lost a major military power, if you like, in the UK's departure. So how do you see, in whatever format, informal or informal, structured or unstructured, future cooperation between the UK and EU in the broad area of foreign and security policy?
I think the short answer would be ad hoc and quite often bilateral. We saw that with the declaration that was signed by Boris Johnson and Angela Merkel, which stressed a huge commonality of view across a swathe of foreign policy issues. We'll see it, I'm sure, down the line in terms of how the UK and the French work together. There's rumours of some additions to the Lancaster House Treaty to be thrashed out for the autumn of this year. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, shared geography condemns us to work together because it means that we have shared interests and confront shared threats. So there will have to be collaboration. You know, take one obvious factor that is never ever mentioned in the United Kingdom, that, you know, we are co-chairing the COP with Italy. You wouldn't know that if you read the UK newspapers, but we are. So you're sort of forced to collaborate in that sense. So yeah, there will be plenty of work together. And actually, to an extent, what we've already seen in terms of the timing of sanctions following what happened in Belarus, for instance, it has worked quite well. Whether it can continue to work that well without any institutional framework remains to be seen. Though I'm relatively relaxed about the lack of an institutional framework for foreign policy, I have to say.
What did you mean by additions to the Lancaster House speech? Please clarify.
The Lancaster House Treaty, which is the sort of the defence cooperation treaty between France and the UK. I've heard from several people that there are plans afoot to try and deepen that cooperation. Okay,
fine. So as you know, the UK is very keen to remind everybody, you mentioned just COP now, and its co-chairmanship of COP26, but also the other major organization that it's not just a member of, but they would argue, the UK would argue, a leading and influential member of NATO, UN Security Council, and so on and so on and so on. To what extent is that a good foundation for the UK, which to not just to build this so-called global Britain vocation that sort of set itself, but also to kind of remind everybody else that the UK is not an inward-looking country?
I mean, yeah, Global Britain was specifically sort of designed to show that Brexit didn't mean we were turning in on the world. But there are sort of two aspects, I think, in terms of an answer to your question. The first, you know, very much in line with the personality of our Prime Minister, is performative. All these institutions provide Boris Johnson with a stage. And as we know, there's nothing that Boris Johnson likes better than a stage. So on the one hand, he's never happier than when he's able to play host at Cornwall. It'll be the same again in November with the Climate Summit, I imagine. So there's an opportunity for him to show himself in the company of world leaders, which he likes. On the substance, I'd say very much, in a sense, the jury is still out. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see, won't it, whether the manifold commitments that are being made as part of this, which is a very big year for British foreign policy, in terms of promises about climate change, in terms of rhetoric about, you know, upholding international law and the liberal international order and Magnitsky sanctions and all those sorts of things, whether or not that interest and relatively high level of activism when it comes to foreign policy persists after this year will be the big question. It's very easy to make promises about climate change. Whether the government is serious about it will be shown by the detail in the domestic legislation and what we actually do to implement the commitments we make in November.
Do you see, as a result of the UK's departure from the EU, already signs, or at least theoretical possibilities, to be more precise, of the EU taking a different direction in whatever field, simply because they can do so now that the UK has left? And if so, will that make future cooperation more problematic?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you could argue that the recovery fund as it exists would not have existed if the UK had been around the table. If you talk to representatives of member states, there are all sorts of things within the European Union that are going to shift as the result of Brexit. It's far more uncomfortable now being a euro out without the UK there alongside you. some member states are slightly queasy about the amount of influence the Franco-German partnership is going to have without what they saw in the past as the British counterbalance. So yeah, things are going to change in the European Union. In foreign policy too, it's conceivable that things might change, though it's too early to say. But without the UK there, the UK was traditionally seen as a force for liberalisation in trade, taking a tough stance on Russia, for instance. It might be without the UK around the table that those things change. Will it make it harder to cooperate? I think in foreign policy terms, it depends on the challenges we're confronted with. It's very, very hard to say, but I think, as ever, it's going to be events that determine that rather than anything else. If we're confronted with a crisis that affects us all, I suspect we'll find ways of working together.
And let's bring in briefly a question from the audience, then we'll come back to my questions. From Bobby McDonough, former ambassador of Ireland to many parts of the world, and also permanent representative to the European Union. Bobby asks, many distinguished former, underlined, British civil servants have been publicly criticising aspects of UK government policy towards the EU. To what extent is rational, asks Bobby, rational internal discussion in Whitehall on EU encouraged or even possible, as far as you know?
Thanks, Bobby. I mean, I'd say a couple of things. I'd say, on the one hand, that some of the more pungent comments from recently retired civil servants don't make the life of current civil servants easier. But secondly, I think my experience is that, there are discussions that go on in Westminster and Whitehall. I mean, we get invited in to talk to senior civil servants and even government ministers. So it's not as if they're closed to the arguments. Whether or not they listen to what we say is a whole different kettle of fish. But I hear you, there is a tension between policy and politics here. In the sense that if you set off saying, how do we optimize our economic relations with the European Union, you wouldn't end up where we are now. If you happen to say, how do I get to number 10 and ensure that I hold my Brexit coalition together, then that's a whole different argument. And that tension between politics and the substance of public policy is particularly acute, I think, at the moment in the United Kingdom.
Well, in that case, a related question from a gentleman called Thomas Phillis, who is at the European Commission, Digit. The question is about how you mentioned earlier about the UK not getting Europe. I think he's coming back by saying, is it about the Conservative Party, more specifically, not getting at Europe? And just wonder whether that is the case. It's a Conservative Party phenomenon much more than a phenomenon of other parties, obviously, in the United Kingdom.
At the moment, it is. Yes, it hasn't always been the case, of course. I mean, the Labour Party in the early 1980s was standing on a platform of withdrawal. So the Labour Party tends to be less hostile to the European Union than the Conservative Party is. I'd say across our political class, though, there is a slight absence of knowledge. I don't think Gordon Brown understood the European Union particularly well. I think amongst the general population, I'm not sure there's a great level of knowledge about the European Union in any member state. But in our member state, at the level of politics, I just think there is a failure to understand how things work and how we can shape things. I think Tony Blair miscalculated over Iraq. It's not confined to the Conservatives. But if you look at how, as we come to the end of Chancellor Merkel's tenure, the number of times that we have fundamentally miscalculated what she thinks and how she's going to react really is quite striking.
Is that a failure then of political judgment, or is it, without putting too much the finger, but also civil servants not being in a position to advise more wisely their political masters?
It's impossible to know for sure, but I'd say the former, probably. Talking to civil servants who were engaged around the time of the Salzburg summit, for instance, the infamous Instagram summit, what they say is we were making it quite clear that you can't just go in there, read out your op-ed and hope that the member states are going to start listening to you more seriously. So I think, as I said, things are intensely political in the United Kingdom at the moment, and that sort of décalage, I can never think of the English word for that, I'm sure there must be one, between the sort of civil service advice and what politicians want to do is particularly wide.
Well, it's good to hear you speaking French, Anand.
Yeah, a long time.
A question from Sandra Kaduri from the organization Keeping Channels Open. Sandra asks, you Anand. Marishevich mentioned the need for predictability and said the word trust about 10 times in his opening keynote. This suggests a need for regularity of engagement on key foreign policy and security issues is good for both sides, building reliability and consistency and a coherent agenda together rather than sporadic initiatives, question mark. Do you agree, I suppose, is the point?
Yeah, I do agree. My sense is that the E3 at least coordinate quite closely and work together quite closely. So I don't think it necessarily has to be the case.
The E3 being Germany, France, and
the UK with the European Union. I mean, one interesting question is the degree to which other member states might start to feel a little bit twitchy if and when the E3 start to do more. That is to say, as was the case when the E3 first came into being over Iran. You get to a point where other member states start saying, oi, hang on a sec, our interests are involved here too. We can't leave this to you. So I think there is a degree of coordination. I think it's in the interest of the UK government that a lot of that is under the sort of radar. I don't think they're going to brag about it to their friends in the media. But I think it's going to be a while before the UK government undertakes that level of coordination with the EU as the EU.
But the E3, of course, predates Brexit. So obviously the three countries involved felt the need and the desirability, if you like, of working together to the exclusion of other member states, right?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. That being the case, the French notably have a range of frustrations with the European Union when it comes to defense policy. And I don't think we'll be shy about trying to collaborate with us, as we are actually at the moment in the Sahel. On a bilateral level when it suits their interests. I mean, the question is where that line is between what you can sort of justifiably do bilaterally and what starts to impinge on what the European Union might have an interest in. And those, we'll figure that out by, we'll learn by doing that, I think.
A question from Jane Morris, former head of the European Commission Office in Belfast and many other important positions, from Jane. Her question, Anna, given the possibility of Scottish independence, would it be wise to extend the Northern Ireland Protocol to Scotland, potentially solving the Irish sea border issue at a time of political sensitivity in Northern Ireland?
I mean, it's not for me to tell the EU what it would be wise to do. I'd say, firstly, Scottish independence is far from inevitable. But secondly, my reading of the EU is that whilst they see every potential applicant as unique and coming with its own set of circumstances and historical baggage, they will not replicate the rather significant concessions they made over Northern Ireland for anyone else. And I think it's worth saying, I mean, in this country in particular, if you say the EU's concessions over the protocol, people will raise their eyebrows. But, the UK has a role in managing the EU's external border, which, of course, Theresa May was told was absolutely not on the table in the negotiations. Why? Because the EU has a particular responsibility towards Northern Ireland, partly through the Good Friday Agreement, partly because the vital national interests of a member state, the Republic, are engaged. I find it inconceivable that the same sort of flexibility would be shown to Scotland when it comes to, as it would, the discussion of the English-Scottish border in the event of Scottish independence.
Let's go back then to the point you made earlier about the UK's left. Brexit is a reality. It's not done, but it's a reality. And you were saying that some member states are concerned now that France and Germany will maybe reassert it themselves in the way they did maybe in previous periods. That's a kind of almost like a conventionalism, isn't it, in European Union circles, that this famous Franco-German and motor engine axis, whatever you want to call it. But surely there are signs of pushback from other member states who don't feel, especially now, that they should be told what to do by France and Germany?
There have always historically been signs of pushback. And, the influence of the Franco-German partnership has waxed and waned over the years. I mean, if you read the book by David Hennig's dad, which I remember reading as a master's student about the Franco-German relationship, I think it was in the 60s and 70s, you'll see it's not always been as influential. It depends on a whole host of factors. Ultimately, however, it might be the case that other member states don't like what they see as an overweening attitude by the larger powers. But when European integration makes progress, when initiatives are hatched and then launched, they tend to have a Franco-German imprimatur on them. That being said, at the moment there is a specific issue, and that is the specific issue between East and West. It's a specific issue of Hungary and Poland, where this isn't simply a question of the French and Germans, throwing their weight about and we don't like them, but there is an ideological element to this now, which is that the Hungarian government and the Polish government feel that those two, Western governments are not just sort of being bullies, but being ideologically sort of party pre, and that makes it slightly more acerbic than normal. Sorry, that was a bit rambling.
No, it was fine. It was fine. It's fine. You said that we said many times in the past, maybe less so now, that Brexit was a lose-lose for both sides. Having said that, now that we are where we are, that awful phrase, are there ways that you think that the UK can now maximise, or just it's the fact that the advantage it has because the UK has left, and start doing things that it couldn't do before because the UK was an awkward member?
It's a lose-lose economically. There's no doubt about that. Can the UK do other things? It can, yes. I mean, one of the great ironies, there are loads of ironies about Brexit. One of the great ironies about Brexit is, if you think about it, the origins of conservative Euroscepticism post-Maastricht lay in a group of people who didn't like the way Brussels, as they saw it, over-regulated. And those conservative Eurosceptics saw leaving the European Union as a way of being able to slash regulation and create the kind of Thatcherite nirvana that actually Mrs. Thatcher herself didn't really want, because she was one of the sort of instigators of the single market. But anyway, that's what history tells us. Fast forward to 2020, and you have the bizarre situation of a conservative prime minister almost walking away from negotiations over the future relationship because EU rules wouldn't let him spend as much state aid as he wanted to. So in an ironic sense, we wanted to be more French and German by the time we actually left, rather than less so in terms of tearing up regulation. And the current Conservative Party and the current Conservative Party in Parliament doesn't, I don't think, have a coherent majority in favour of deregulation. So the sorts of things you might have expected Britain to do, having left the European Union, now politically look vanishingly unlikely. In a sense, the one big substantive change that Brexit has wrought is it's changed the nature of our political debate. Now, I'm sure many people in the audience will say, but it makes no sense. It's obviously ridiculous to think that you need to leave the European Union to level up the country. And they're right. And actually, leveling up is harder outside the European Union because of the economic impact that Brexit will have. But levelling up is front and centre of the political agenda because of that referendum. In a way, arguably, it would never have been without that referendum. So when you talk about opportunities, I don't think it's wholly unreasonable for Workington Man, because he's the new man in our sort of political debate, to think that there might be opportunities out of Brexit for Workington, because actually you finally have a government that is willing to think about places like that and invest in places like that in a way, arguably, that no government has done for 30 or 40 years.
Right. Another question from the audience, from Adam Isaacs, the head of unit at the European Parliament. What do you think, Anand, that the UK government view what it gained from refusing to grant the EU ambassador full diplomatic status, just like Trump did, says Adam? What did it achieve by doing that?
I don't really, I don't know is the simple answer. As far as I can see, though people in government dispute this, but without any details, the UK government simply caved over this issue. I don't know whether it was Dominic Raab showing his credentials to the Conservative Party or what it was, but ultimately, insofar as it achieved anything, it was purely political and nothing at all substantive. And of course, in the process, made Lindsay Appleby's job far, far harder than it needed to be. Yeah,
well, I hope that's now water under the bridge. A question from Pierre-Emmanuel Thoman of Geopolitical.
So actually, someone should ask Lindsay that question.
Yes, I think Katja Adler might well ask him that in a couple of hours' time. A long question from Pierre-Emmanuel Thoman. I hope I do it justice, Pierre-Emmanuel, by reading it out. It's quite a long question. Regarding France-UK geopolitical priorities, although they have a common interest in maintaining nuclear power status, they have diverging priorities in continental Europe, as France would be in favor of a new European security architecture with Russia. The de Gaulle vision, says Pierre-Emmanuel, since radical Islam is the real enemy, when the UK is more reliant on the US and considers Russia as an adversary. So what do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely true. The one thing I should say to you, Paul, is please, for God's sake, don't say can I read the question? Because I'm on this laptop and I'm quite old and I can't even see the letters, let alone the words.
Don't worry, I'm reading them for you. Don't worry.
Okay, good. Because you are, as we all know, younger than me.
Much younger.
No, that's absolutely true. When I say France and the UK have shared geopolitical interests, I'm not saying all their interests are shared or all their priorities are the same. And absolutely, in the case of Russia, they are divergent. But in the Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa, when it comes to the sort of Far East, there is a striking convergence in the rhetoric of French and British governments. When it comes to willingness to deploy force, there's a striking convergence between the French and British governments. So I think there is enough common ground to allow for fruitful cooperation without for a moment suggesting that the two agree on everything.
Right. Time's running out. The time has flown. We have time for 2 more questions from the audience.
An exam.
It is a bit, isn't it? Yeah. You're used to those, more invigilating rather than doing them. A question from Francis Jacobs, former, I think, European Union civil servant, now University College Dublin, on political parties in Europe. Most of them, apart from the DUP, have links, some quite strong, says Francis, with European political parties, but the Conservative Party does not, apart from with the Polish Law and Justice Party and a few other nationalist right-wing parties. How significant is this?
It is and has been tremendously significant. It was significant in terms of shaping Mrs. Merkel's view of David Cameron way back when he took the Conservatives out of the European People's Party. It was significant in the sense that those informal meetings of leaders were very, very good ways of picking up political intelligence about what other member states were and were not thinking. I wonder whether the debacle of December 2011 would have happened if David Cameron was well plugged into the thinking of the other centre-right parties across the European Union. And it continues to be significant for the reasons I spoke about before, because I think building those networks with political leaders in other member states is absolutely fundamental, not in some Remainery, how do we figure out how to rejoin the European Union way, but simply in terms of understanding our partners, understanding their priorities and finding out on which issues we can work together and where actually there's no point really trying. So I think those personal contacts and networks that, institutions like Königswinter or the Colloque or Pontignano try to build are crucial. And one of the things I hope for in the future is that UK politicians, particularly conservative UK politicians, will engage in those conversations.
Right. And we only have time for one more question, unfortunately, from Rupert Wilkinson.
A long answer.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Rupert Wilkinson, Administrator at the European Parliament. You suggested that COP26 and climate change is an obvious topic for UK-EU cooperation. What other areas do you think you might envisage for cooperation?
Well, I think sanctions is the other obvious one. If it comes to imposing sanctions on states, it will be far more effective from a UK point of view to work with the European Union than to not work with the European Union. I think ultimately the bottom line is it is good for the UK, for the EU's economy to thrive, and it is good for the EU, for the UK's economy to thrive. At the moment, as I said, political considerations mean, and this is a real sort of spanner in the works, that might not be how both sides are currently thinking. But I think across the board, because we're neighbours, because we're partners, because like it or not, we trade quite a lot together, there are a raft of issues over which our interests are aligned. The only question is whether or not we can make it work outside those areas covered by the TCA without the need for formal institutional cooperation between the UK and the EU as the EU. And I think that time will tell. And it might well be that the UK learns some lessons about that and learns that actually that cooperation needs to be more institutionalized than we originally thought.
Thank you very much, Anand. We have to leave it there, run out of time. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you.
I see you, Paul.
See you soon.
Next time in person.
Yes, absolutely.
All the best.
Thank you very much. And a message to the audience, don't go away. The next session is Raoul Rapparel, former advisor to the British government under Theresa May's government, in conversation with George Park, political editor of the Financial Times. So stay tuned. Bye-bye.